to set up the opening argument that I want to do about RFK, I want to watch a old clip of him, right? So, and when I say old, I don't mean like from the 1980s. I mean from 2023, which feels like, you know, in the relative to the overall RFK saga, this feels like the beginning of time.
And is that just a matter of different personnel? Or do you need to have a public option for pharmaceutical companies? Do you need to nationalize the pharmaceutical industry? What does that actually look like?
I don't think that's the right thing. I think we need to get pharmaceutical money out of the regulatory agencies. NIH personnel should not be able to collect royalties on pharmaceutical products that they worked on, which they can do today. NIH has devolved from being a research agency that's supposed to be improving American health, and instead it's become an incubator for pharmaceutical products. So they develop, you know, initial pharmaceutical products in their lab, and then they farm that product out to a university, and they give the universities hundreds of millions of dollars, and to go through phase 1 and phase 2 trials, and then they bring in a pharmaceutical company if the drug works, which they almost always do because they can make them look like they work. And then they bring in a pharmaceutical company to do the phase 3, which is very, very expensive, may cost $1 billion. And along the way, everybody gets a piece of the patent. So NIH gets a piece of the patent. For example, NIH owns half the Moderna patent. And, you know, there's been billions and billions of dollars, maybe 100 billion so far on that platform, on that mRNA platform that NIH developed. And NIH stands to collect half of that money. Not only that, but individuals within NIH, you know, the deputies of Anthony Fauci, have margin rights on that patent. So they can collect $150,000 a year for life, and then their children and so on, as long as that product's being sold. And what that means is that the regulatory function of the agency is subsumed by these, you know, the mercantile ambitions of these regulators who are no longer regulators.
Isn't the profit motive, though, at the core of that problem? Because the problem you're describing isn't unique to FDA, NIH, et cetera. You can go down, I know you would talk about the EPA, you probably have direct experience there as an environmental lawyer, but you can go down the list of these agencies and you see the way the revolving door works, you see the way that there's a lot of industry capture, because ultimately, you know, we have a health insurance industry and a hospital industry and a pharmaceutical industry that has the bottom line as the bottom line. Isn't that really the root of the problem here?
Well, do you mean human nature?
I mean the profit motive. I mean putting the profit motive above health.
The profit motive is human nature.
Everything that's human nature is naturally something that we can't curb. We can't try to do anything about in a policy perspective, right? But Ben, it's time for the opening argument, correct?
Yeah, let's do it. So it seems to me that RFK Jr. has two kinds of apologists, depending on who they're trying to sell him to and why, although the two lines of apologetics often do overlap. The first way to defend RFK, especially when you're defending him to nervous moderate Republicans who are afraid he might just be way too much of a kook, is to say he's a reasonable guy. He's a victim of a frame-up by the radical left. Actually, he's not even really anti-vax at all. He just has maybe, you know, libertarian concerns that the COVID lockdowns 5 years ago were too heavy-handed, or maybe reasonable safety worries about the COVID vaccines being approved in a process that was too quick or exempted the producers from too much liability. But hey, how can he be some anti-vax nutcase when he himself has taken various other kinds of vaccines, and his children have, and as my favorite Slovenian would say, and so on and so on and so on. The second way to defend him, which isn't necessarily inconsistent with the first one, but might be in some tension with it, depending on how hard you lean into it, is the way that idiots like Jimmy Dore defend him, which is to portray him as a bold anti-establishment truth teller who saw through the big lies being pushed by big pharma, and who's the most steadfast, the most radical, the most courageous enemy of the pharmaceutical industry. And I think both of these defenses just collapse given the least little bit of scrutiny. Start with the first one. since it's further from my core interests, so I have less to say about it, but I do want to say a couple of things. First, there's just way too long a record of Kennedy saying absolutely batshit things about COVID and about vaccines that have nothing to do with COVID to really make this defense stick. He was repeating the long since debunked conspiracy theory that vaccines caused autism as recently as 2023. The same year, he was caught on tape at a private event, with donors, speculating that COVID might be an, and I quote, ethnically targeted bioweapon. And his defenders will tell you, oh, Ben, you're not being fair. He didn't say definitely, he just said might, or I've even seen people saying, oh, he was just speculating about what might happen in the future. But in context, part of what he's saying is definitely about reasons to think that COVID itself might be one. And man, I've said the word COVID way too many times already in this segment. We are totally getting demonetized, but hell with it. He actually said that the reason to think that COVID might be an ethnically targeted bioweapon is that it has more effect on some groups than others. And he claimed it had a lot of effect on Caucasians and Black people, but exempts, and I swear to God, this is an exact quote from the recording. These were the words he used. It spares Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese. So the idea that he's actually this very moderate guy with a very narrow, reasonable set of concerns is just totally detached from reality. But conversely, the idea that he's this super courageous, radical truth teller, the greatest living enemy of capital B, capital P, big pharma, is also completely ludicrous. And I realize that at this point, it might sound like the two halves of what I'm saying might be in tension too, if not outright inconsistent. Because here I am denying that he's this very moderate, mild-mannered guy, and also denying that he's this courageous radical. But I think we need to make a basic distinction here. On the one hand, the question is how extreme he is in his anti-establishment views with regard to actual medical science. And on the other hand, how extreme is he in any anti-establishment views he might have when it comes to the core fundamental injustice of the American healthcare system? The reason why ordinary Americans are so outraged and disgusted at that system that a pretty astonishing number of normies, in my experience, people who do not have generally radical views or not even particularly political, have expressed sympathy with Luigi Mangione actually assassinating a health insurance executive on the streets of Manhattan. Because my position on this is that on the first question, the medical science question, the man is out to lunch. He's out of his goddamn mind. But on the second question, the question of healthcare justice, there's nothing really radical about him at all. And that, unfortunately, is entirely consistent. I've already shown you some of my work on the first half, the conspiratorial nonsense half, but I want to hone in for the rest of this on the second half. Think about that clip we showed you a couple minutes ago. My friend Crystal asked Kennedy whether he agreed that the root of the problem with America's healthcare system was a health insurance industry and a hospital industry and a pharmaceutical industry where the bottom line is the bottom line. And he responded, oh, that just sounds like human nature. Right? That's what Jake was just saying. Crystal clarified that she was talking about the profit motive, and RFK just shrugged off the distinction. He said, these are the exact words you just saw him say. The profit motive is human nature. But there's nothing natural about the way that the United States ties healthcare to the profit motive, right? Lets it be a factor in that system. As far as I know, America is the only country in the developed world where cash-strapped diabetics sometimes die because they have to resort to rationing out their insulin. In many other nations around the world, healthcare is treated as a basic right, funded by taxation and provided free at the point of service. As far as I know, right? Not only is nobody in Canada or Britain or Norway or Sweden or etc. rationing out their insulin, nobody in those places has to stay in a job they hate because of fear of losing their employer health insurance. No one in those countries ends up staying in a bad marriage in part for fear of losing spousal health insurance. No one in any of those places who's grieving for a dead parent has to spend half their life on the telephone arguing about unpaid hospital bills. But all of these things are routine parts of American life. And of course, we know what an actually meaningful solution to all of that looks like, right? In his runs for president in 2016 and 2020, right, Bernie proposed this single-payer Medicare for all system that would be similar. I mean, the details vary, but broadly similar to what exists in the countries that I just listed. Debates over that proposal dominated the 2020 race on the Democratic side, with a variety of shades of opinion. And Joe Biden, who unfortunately ultimately won, hence Trump being president again now, thought he could split the difference, right? Said, okay, I don't agree with this Medicare for all thing. That goes too far. But how about a public option, right? That a government-run plan that maybe you could very cheaply buy into or be heavily subsidized or whatnot would compete with the private plans. Now, he dropped that idea cold as soon as he took office. I don't think I've literally heard the man mention it in 4 years. But that was his proposal at the time. And at the time, people like me, right, who were writing, Bernie is right about X, Bernie is right about Y articles for Jacobin every 5 minutes, thought that a public option, was a way worse idea than Medicare for all. Right, a public plan you could buy into, however cheaply, would replicate at least some of the big problems with private healthcare. Right, people who missed a couple of payments, would end up getting cut off. Right, no matter how cheap you made it, and they'd be out of luck in a medical emergency, and maybe even more seriously, very much like Medicaid in the current system, it's overwhelmingly likely that there would be lots of doctors and hospitals that wouldn't take the public plan, and this gets into the more general problem, which is the sort of basic health justice objection to a public option, which is that, look, would it be better than what we have now? Of course. But it would still be two-tiered healthcare for rich people and poor people. And I think this really shows you how bad RFK Jr. always was, that he could never even really stir himself up to champion a public option, right? So a couple minutes after the part that we just showed you in the breaking points, he, Crystal very directly asks him about this, and he says, well, my highest ambition would be to have, he uses different words, but he's describing a public option, right? He said there'd be government healthcare, but also there'd be private health insurance. But I don't think it's politically realistic, right? So the most he would do is take the Biden 2020 position, but also say, I'm not really going to talk about that much because it's just not politically realistic. And in the part you did watch, right, when Crystal asked him if he would be in favor of nationalizing pharmaceutical companies, or even if those companies did stay in place, at least doing a public option there, right, manufacturing generic drugs in the public sector, right, he dismisses it without a second thought, right? You heard him. He says, no, I don't think that's the right thing, and changes the subject. And that interview, the part we just showed you, that was when he was challenging Biden for the Democratic nomination. And he had every incentive in the world to present himself as being more progressive than he is. And that's how bad he was even then, right? Now he's going to be serving in a Republican cabinet. It seems like a pretty safe bet that he's going to be even less inclined to interfere with the profit motive that we just saw him say is nothing more than human nature. And I think the basic point here is very simple, right? Our healthcare system is a nightmare, but we need to be able to distinguish between diametrically opposed critiques of it. Is the problem that rent-seeking private companies stand between, suffering people in the healthcare they need, whether we're talking about the pharma companies or the health insurers, or is the problem that the healthcare itself doesn't work, or at least that parts of it don't work, like the COVID vaccine? And by the way, the more RFK pushes quack remedies or discourages people from taking vaccines, or succeeds in undermining the scientific establishment on those questions, this is a point that actual friend of the show, not like friend of the show Alex Jones, Dr. Eric Osgood made on Twitter the other day. To the extent that RFK succeeds in discouraging people from taking low-cost, one-time preventative measures like vaccines, the more that they'll develop health problems that are going to lead them realistically to buy expensive long-term drugs from those same pharma companies that Jimmy Dore claims that RFK is the last hero standing up against. And of course, it's not like pharma companies can't make money on quack cures as much as scientifically valid ones. Oh, and I certainly haven't heard RFK endorse Bernie's longtime proposal to abolish pharmaceutical patents, just have like one-time cash prizes for breakthroughs, which makes it grimly funny to see some of these people I'm talking about running around claiming that Bernie is a shill for big pharma because he's been fighting with RFK at the confirmation hearings. And by the way, the video from Breaking Points where RFK was still trying to appeal to disenchanted progressive voters, and so, again, presenting his views in a better light than he will now, wasn't bad enough for you. I think any last lingering shred that you have in the back of your head of, oh, maybe this guy isn't so bad, should blow into the wind when you see this last clip on what happened when Bernie asked RFK a very simple question at the confirmation hearing. So to be clear about the context for this clip that we're about to watch, I mean, Bernie repeats it like 2 seconds into the clip anyway, but the question that he's answering at the beginning of the clip is, do you think healthcare is a human right?
Senator, I can't give you a yes or no answer to that question.
Healthcare a human right? Is healthcare a human right?
In the way that free speech is a human right,
yeah.
I would say it's different because with free speech doesn't cost anybody anything, but in healthcare, if you smoke cigarettes for 20 years and you get cancer, you are now taking from the pool. Well, and so are you guaranteed the same right, or is there also a duty?
I'm sorry. I'd love to talk for an hour with you. We got a few minutes left here. All right. Every other country on earth says healthcare, whether you're poor or rich, young or old, is a human right. I'm not hearing you say that. All right. You've talked about the drug companies, and maybe we...
So, again, they're about to go on to other things, but I really want to laser focus on what you just heard. Right? There are two ways of interpreting the argument against Medicare for all, against recognizing healthcare as a human right that you just listened to. The first, and the one that kind of starts out sounding like he's doing, is a general libertarian point that the libertarian perspective on this is that there just are no positive rights, right? Or at least that's what a lot of people who we'd think of as like deontic libertarians. They're not just people who think libertarianism leads to better political outcomes. But people who are like in principle libertarians will often say, well, there are no positive rights. There could never be a right to have some people do something for you. There can only be negative rights, right? Rights for people to not do certain things to you. And certainly that's the way that a lot of his fans seemed to interpret what RFK was saying there. I posted about this, and I just said something like, "My God, what an evil answer!" And there were a bunch of his defenders swarming in the replies, and I'd see people saying things like, some of them were repeating this kind of point that Rand Paul made a long time ago. And like, I remember we did a TMBS segment once about Dan Crenshaw saying it, which is, oh, if you have a right to have something done for you, that means that somebody else, has an obligation to do it for you. So if you think about it, if you're saying you have a right to healthcare, that means that you think that like doctors and nurses and people who work at hospitals should be slaves, right? Like that's the kind of thing that you get in the comments. Now, it should probably go without saying that none of the many countries around the world that Bernie was referring to in that clip that legally enshrine healthcare as a basic right actually enslave doctors, nurses, or hospital janitors. Just in case anybody does need to hear that said explicitly, that I promise you that's not a thing that happens. And just to reinforce that point, right? Even many conservatives and even more moderate libertarians might believe that the public has a right to, police and fire protection, maybe even that every child has a right to a public education, at least K-12, that's where they cut off. But no one thinks that anybody should be forced at gunpoint to become a firefighter or a cop or a public school teacher, right? What the left advocates is that, as with these other services, the state should provide everybody with it, free at the point of service, funded by progressive taxation, not that any particular person should be forced to go into it. The slightly less absurd version of the in principle libertarian argument that a right to, public health care or for that matter, public schooling or, fire department or whatever is a violation of real negative rights, holds that the rights violation comes not in some fantastical scenario about frog marching doctors to work with rifles poking their backs, but in the taxation to pay for it, right? Even the scaled back version, though, doesn't really make sense when it's subjected to any kind of scrutiny. First, because even if we accept the premise that there's some sort of universal negative right against taxation, that would just mean we have a conflict between two rights, that we would now have to decide whether the right to health care for example, cancer patients was more or less morally urgent than the right of rich people to every penny in their bank account. And then secondly, the idea that if there's this universal right against redistribution, I think is either based on extremely implausible libertarian theories of property rights that, you go back to the sort of John Locke view about mixing your labor, with nature. And it's the sort of weird metaphysical view that I think is very implausible and nobody actually believes for any reason other than that it gets them the result that they want. I realize this is me being tendentious as hell, but I'm happy to have that argument anytime with anybody who's watching this who thinks I'm being unfair right now. But honestly, it always reminds me of like the theory of property rights of like little boys who are arguing about some possession. One of them's like, oh, I spit on it, it's mine now. Or else you're just doing the completely circular thing, which is like, oh, the non-aggression principle says you can't take away somebody's property from them. And well, what do you mean by their property? Either you mean what's legally theirs, in which case state redistribution can't violate that, or you mean what's morally theirs, in which case that's just begging the question. That's the issue on the table that we're arguing about, right? Is who's more morally entitled to the money in Jeff Bezos' bank account, the doctor who's treating the cancer patients or Bezos himself? And then the other sort of way, besides that general libertarian argument, to interpret what RFK is saying here is, well, premise one, smokers who get lung cancer don't have a right to be treated. Premise two, if healthcare was a human right, they would have a right to be treated. And conclusion, healthcare is not a human right. But like, why should anybody believe actually either of the premises there, right? So maybe Kennedy is saying that treating lung cancer patients would be a waste of scarce resources. If so, it's hard to overstate how extremely extreme and radical that claim would be. As far as I know, there's no health system on the planet, public or private, that has decided as a matter of policy either that no lung cancer patients will be treated, right? Zero hospital beds for lung cancer patients, or else that they that you won't be treated if you got lung cancer in one of the very most common ways to get lung cancer, right? Which is from tobacco. So if RFK truly believes that the United States should be the first country in the world to say lung cancer patients who got it from tobacco aren't going to be medically treated, I mean, I think this is really an exciting new frontier in social cruelty that he's advocating that we cross. Far more likely, though, he's just advocating that we stay at something closer to the current level of social cruelty, right? That the idea is that lung cancer patients with money to burn, right, will still get top-notch care, and the ones who are strapped for cash will have far fewer options. And this is the last point I want to make about this. It's true enough, right? He's not wrong about this much. As pissed off as I was when I watched this clip, right? I want to be fair about this. He's right that no medical system, public or private, has unlimited resources. While taking care of lung cancer patients is an incredibly basic function of every normal medical system, very much included the ones where care is universal and free at the point of service. it's true enough that even the most lavishly funded system always has to find some way to prioritize some patients over others when you do run up against the limits of the system's resources, right? And there is always going to be a limit somewhere. That's not wrong. Right? Medical ethics boards and the like face a thankless and often grisly task in making those determinations. I don't want to undersell that issue. But the very worst, most inhuman way of deciding who to prioritize is by using financial status, right? Letting rich people bribe their way to the front of the line while other people in similar circumstances die because of the state of their bank account. And it seems to me that that is exactly what RFK is advocating, and that's obscene. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.